Before daylight, I had rushed to Bretteville with several liaisons on motorcycles to get a general idea of what had happened. For a few seconds I enjoyed the green of the forest and thought of the weeks we had spent on those quiet forest roads in 1942 during the division's finalization. The noise of the front brought me back to reality. The death and destruction was not conducive to memories of happier times. The rumble of battle sounded like the deafening rattle of the drums of destruction. There was no sound of fanfare heralding victory. At Irville, I talked with Moenke and received the first reports of the night's events. The positions of the 89th Infantry Division had been overrun by the enemy. The division was virtually destroyed. A few strongholds were still fighting. They were like islands in the maelstrom of battle, now and then giving the attacking Canadians a warm welcome. There was no communication with the units in the front line, and the remaining pockets of resistance fought on their own. The defenders had to rely now only on their own strength. Our brave soldiers stood like rocks under the iron flow of the Canadian tank armada and again forced it to stop. The great good fortune was that I knew this terrain in every detail. I had been here with my reconnaissance battalion in the fall of 1942, and we had done a lot of training. So I knew that the high ground at Pertigny dominated the terrain and the Liaison River was a natural barrier to the tanks. The Canadian attack had to be stopped north of Pertigny, otherwise the fate of our 7th and 5th Armies would be sealed. I moved in the direction of Bretteville-sur-Lez with the express intention of holding the line of the River Lezon. Bretteville had become impassable. The streets were littered with the rubble of houses destroyed by bomb blasts. To get to Cintou, we drove through open fields. Cintou was a fairly large settlement and was situated so that the Cannes-Falaise road ran through it. There was hardly any traffic on the main street. And who would drive on it nowadays? The 89th Infantry Division was north of Cintou. From there and south to Falaise, there was a huge gap in our defences. The Allied objective, the area they so zealously sought, stretched out before them, undefended and unoccupied by anyone. At Shinto, I found a platoon of tank fighters from Waldmüller's battle group. Showing prudence, Waldmüller during the night changed the location of the platoon because the previous location was subjected to shelling. I could not believe my eyes. Groups of German soldiers were fleeing south in panic on both sides of the Cannes-Falaise road. It was the first time in these long years of terrible war that I had seen German soldiers running. They paid no attention to anything. They went through the hellfire and ran, stumbling past us with eyes full of terror. I stared in amazement at the no-one-led groups of soldiers. My uniform clung to my body. The enormous burden of responsibility I suddenly felt made me drench myself in sweat. I suddenly realized that the fate of Falaise and our two armies depended on my decision. I stood in the Volkswagen and drove towards Caen. I saw more and more demoralized soldiers running in a southerly direction. I tried unsuccessfully to stabilize the crumbling front. Terrifying bombardment was robbing units of the 89th Infantry Division of their presence of mind. Shells were falling on the road, devastating it. The withdrawal could only continue on both sides of the road. I jumped out of the vehicle and stood alone in the middle of the road. I slowly drove up to the front and turned to the fleeing soldiers. They were dumbfounded and stopped. They looked at me incredulously, surprised that I was standing on the road armed, with only a car. The young soldiers probably thought I was crazy. But then they recognized me, turned around and began waving to their comrades, urging them to organize a defense around Shintou. It had to be held at all costs to buy time for the task forces to approach. Speed was imperative. I reached Monkey's headquarters after the bombardment. He was sitting among the ruins on the roof of a mobile radio station, looking worse for wear. Monkey had his hands around his head. He couldn't hear anything. All the messenger motorcyclists were wounded. At Monkey's place I saw the commander of the 5th Tank Army, General of Tank Forces Eberbach. The general had come to see firsthand the effects of the recent Allied attacks and to make decisions based on personal observations. The commander gave me full discretion and agreed with my assessment of the situation. Meanwhile, Hubert Meyer had sent Waldmüller's battle group to Bretteville-de-Robe. There it could act according to the situation. I issued the following orders. 1. Waldmüller's battle group, reinforced by the 1st Battalion of the 12th SES Tank Regiment and the remnants of the 101st SE's Heavy Tank Battalion to counter-attack in order to capture the high ground south of St. Annan. 2. The Divisional Escort Company, reinforced by the 1st Company of the 12th SES Fighter Anti-Tank Battalion, to advance through Estuary and occupy the high ground west of St. Sylvain. 3. Krause's battle group, reinforced by the 2nd Battalion, 12th Tank Regiment, to withdraw from the battle with the enemy, occupy the high ground west of Potigny and defend the area between the rivers Lezen and Les. 4. Division Command Post is located at Potigny. I will be with a battle group Waldmüller. I met Waldmüller north of Bretteville-de-Raab, and we drove together to Sinter to orient ourselves to the situation. Whitman's Tigers were already standing east of Sintu, sheltered behind a wooded strip. So far, they had not yet been put into action. Sinter was under artillery fire. The open countryside, however, appeared as if it had not been shelled. From the northern outskirts of the town, we could see dense columns of enemy tanks north of the road to Bretteville-sur-Lez. The tanks were marching closely together. The same thing was happening south of Garcelles and on the edge of the forest southeast of it. The massing of tanks simply amazed us. We did not understand the behavior of the Canadians. Why was this colossal tank force not thrown into the attack? Why was the Canadian command giving us time and opportunity to take countermeasures? There were no fear-inspiring fighters. The systematic use of fighter planes alone would have destroyed the remnants of my division on National Highway 158, which provided the breakthrough of our defences by II Canadian Corps. Nothing then would have prevented the Canadians from gaining possession of Falaise that evening. God alone knows why it did not happen. The enemy's tank division stood at the ready to advance on all roads. Waldmüller and I knew that we could not allow the enemy tanks to launch another attack. This attack must not be launched. We must try to retake the initiative. I decided to defend Shintou with the forces already engaged and lightning attack with all available units east of the road. In this way I hoped to disrupt the enemy's plans. As a target, I chose the forest southeast of Garcelles. We were to take the risk and attack to gain time to organize defenses at the turn of the Lezen River. The plan was to launch the attack at 12:30. During my last meeting with Waldmüller and Whitman, we noticed a single bomber flying over us a couple of times, dropping flares. It appeared to us to be some sort of flying command post, and I ordered an immediate attack to get the units out of the area of possible bombardment. I shook Michael Whitman's hand again and called his attention to the extremely critical situation. Michael laughed, as only young men laugh, and climbed into his TV Tiger. He already had 138 enemy tanks to his credit. Would he increase this score, or would he become a victim himself? The tanks rolled quickly northward. They crossed the open terrain at speed and used the folds of the terrain to engage the enemy. The tank attack aided the rush of the grenadiers. They approached the target of the attack, spreading out widely. I was on the northern outskirts of Shintou. The enemy artillery opened a barrage of fire on the attacking tanks. Tiger Michael Whitman rushed under enemy fire. I knew how he acted in such cases. He knew to keep moving, don't stop, to rush forward and create some space for ourselves for freedom of action. Our tanks were advancing through a veritable hell of steel and fire. They had to keep the enemy tanks from attacking. They had to disrupt his plan. Waldmüller and his grenadiers followed the tanks. Magnificent soldiers followed their officers. In the midst of the sweeping artillery fire, a machine gunner called out to me. It was pointing to the northwest. I saw an endless chain of large four-engine bombers coming toward us. The ironic remarks of a few soldiers allowed us to forget in a split second the enormous danger. A young soldier from Berlin exclaimed, "What an honor Churchill is doing us by sending a bomber for each of us." As a matter of fact, he was quite right. There were more bombers approaching us than there were German soldiers huddled on the ground. I believed that moment there was only one way of escape. to leave the village and move out into the open. With lightning speed, the defenders of Shemto left the settlement and waited for the bombs to explode in the green fields north of it. We were right, because we knew that in the course of the fighting, village after village was being flattened by the Allied Air Force. Soon, huge sheaves of fire soared into the sky. We noted with satisfaction that the American aviation also covered the Canadian. Due to a guidance plane error, bombs fell on their attacking orders as well. The commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, General Keller, was severely wounded and forced to abandon his division. The last waves of bombers flew over Waldmüller's vigorously attacking battle group, without dropping a single bomb on a single tank or armoured vehicle. The air crews of the planes were engaged in their designated targets, not worrying about the fact that in the meantime the situation had changed. Apparently, the Canadian tank divisions were going into battle without the involvement of Air Force liaison officers, and therefore could not influence the actions of the attacking bombers. At this point it became clear to me why the head units of the Canadian ground forces did not continue the attack, and we had the time necessary to take countermeasures. Without realizing the true nature of the situation, the attacking divisions were tied to the Canadian Corps' movement schedule. As a result, instead of victory, they found themselves outmaneuvered. A tank battle cannot be led from behind a desk with a map spread out on it. A responsible tank commander must be together with the forward units of his attacking troops in order to make a decision in time to meet the situation and deliver a decisive blow. A tank attack broken into phases is like a cavalry attack with a scheduled break to feed the horses. The introduction of the 9th American Air Army into the battle could not affect the effectiveness of our counterattack. Waldmüller's battle group approached a section of forest and engaged the Polish infantry. A brutal tank battle ensued between tanks of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division and Michael Whitman's Tigers. At times the Tigers were not visible at all. Against them was a concentrated and rapidly changing direction of enemy artillery fire. In the meantime, we had regained our former positions at Sintu. The settlement was under attack from the north and was in the sector of direct fire from Canadian tanks. The flank fire of several of Whitman's Tigers helped keep the Canadian Shermans at bay and prevented them from approaching Sintu. We could see that a large enemy force was advancing a kilometre in front of us. They were tearing towards Bretteville-sur-Lez. Their attacks were smothered one after another. We had extraordinary good fortune. Our opponents did not hold against us a single massive concentrated attack. From the Divisional Escort Company reported that it is west of Saint-Sylvain. It had already fought with advanced units of the 1st Polish Panzer Division and destroyed several armoured vehicles. The Poles no longer tried to stick out of the woods near Garcelles. Later we learned that this was the first combat operation of the 1st Polish Panzer Division. The battle had already been going on for several hours. Our wounded were collected south of Sintu. They were evacuated under enemy fire. Toward evening I found that neither the army nor the corps was able to send us reinforcements anymore. A few Tigers were all that was in their power. I hoped that Krause's battle group had already reached the Potinai section in time and organized a defense. At this point I had not yet received any reports from Krause. Toward evening intelligence reported the loss of the town of Bretteville-sur-Lez. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division under Major General L. Fawkes had defeated scattered units of the 89th Infantry Division there, so organized defense of the town was out of the question. The defenders had no anti-tank means or The battle north and east of Shinto continued until darkness fell. It was a miracle that with the overwhelming superiority of the enemy we were not defeated much earlier. Our heavy tanks ploughed across the battlefield like battleships in a sea battle. Their formidable guns must have inspired respect from the attacking enemy units. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division under General Kitching was unable to crush the pitiful handful of German grenadiers. Sintu was still in the hands of a dozen soldiers. After the loss of the town of Bretteville-sur-Lez, the enemy cut deeply into our defences, outflanking the battle group Waldmüller and the heroic defenders of Sintu. As a result, the 12th Armoured Division decided, under cover of darkness, to bring the battle group back to the Lezon River line and hold this position until the arrival of the 85th Infantry Division, the defenders of Sintu and the armoured vehicles of Waldmüller's battle group. Under cover of tanks, were easily able to withdraw from the battle and were deployed on my orders in the woods near Chateau Quesnay. South of Sintu, I contacted the commander of the 89th Infantry Division. Apparently, the general had experienced the most difficult day of his military career. It was not easy for him to realize that his division now consisted of only a few disparate units. Together with him, we left the village of Bretteville-de-Rabe shortly after midnight. Together with the tanks providing cover, we were the last of the German soldiers and officers to leave the battle area on August 8. When I arrived at the command post, Hubert Meyer reported to me that Krause's battle group was only able to withdraw from the battle with the enemy by the evening of August 8 and reach the position it had been ordered to occupy. The privates and officers presented a pitiful sight. The soldiers had been continuously engaged in heavy fighting since June 6 and were at the limit of their strength. Exhausted bodies longed for a few hours of sleep on the hard Normandy soil. We had been talking about the failure to win the war for the previous weeks, berating this protracted armed conflict with all the horrors it had brought to mankind. Why have we not called for an end to it? Why do we continue the futile slaughter? Full of despair, we searched for an answer to these questions. The soldiers and officers saw the turn the situation was taking, but no one thought of laying down their arms or of trying in any way to find safety. We saw the political aims of the Allies as far more terrible than the most horrible death. Death had long ago lost its power of intimidation for us. We saw in death the providence of God and, as a result, freedom from all worries. We continued to fight in our right mind. Even in such a hopeless situation, we believed that we had to fulfill our duty to our fatherland. By candlelight, I was writing a birthday greeting to my daughter. In a few days, she would be 1 year old. The division issued the following orders for the defense of the border of the River Liesen. Battle Group Krause to defend the high ground north of Mézières and Roux, including Height 132. Waldmüller's battle group to defend the area from Hill 140 to Hill 183 on the Faloise-Camin Road. The 3rd Battalion of the 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment to defend Height 195 and to gather all scattered soldiers of the 89th Infantry Division. All tanks of the 12th Armoured Division and the 101st SE's Heavy Tank Battalion are to be deployed in the woods near Quesnay under the command of the commander of the 12th Cis Tank Regiment. Divisional artillery to take up positions south of the Liesen River to provide effective support for the entire division. The Divisional Escort Company remains under the control of Division Headquarters at Pottigny. Locate the Division Command Post 1 km east of Pottigny near Tambo de Marie-Jolie. August 8. Olbuters Group secured a defensive position on the height of 195. It was considerably reinforced by men of the 89th Infantry Division. Artillery also took the intended positions by 22.0 of the same day. The commander of the 12th STCT Regiment reported the concentration of tanks at Quesnay at 3.0. No reports had yet come from Waldmüller's battle group and the divisional headquarters company. Dawn was coming. I climbed to the heights near Tambolt de Marie-Jolie and listened. The defence area near the Liesen River was quiet for the time being. The peace of the picturesque surroundings had not yet been disturbed. Through binoculars, I looked at the height opposite me. Its slope was covered with still green fields of grain, still shrouded in the shroud of sleep. On the hilltops, slender fir trees swayed in the first rays of sunlight. Even the glistening dew on the grass sparkled so wonderfully, as if nature wanted to make me forget the war for a few moments. At last the sun appeared, and thousands of tiny birds chirped their greetings. The silence, however, was deceptive. Although I did not notice any movement, I knew that our tigers and panthers were in the woods near Quesnay and had been put on alert to cut short the lives of the enemy's young soldiers. My exhausted soldiers were lying at this moment somewhere among the fields of grain crops, waiting for the enemy to attack. On the opposite slope to our right, The long barrels of a battery of 88 guns also froze, waiting for their allied casualties. Perhaps on the other side, too, the barrels of guns and mortars were already aimed at the exhausted soldiers of my division. And just at that moment, the enemy units were starting tank engines and issuing the first orders to take our lives. Silence was deceptive. Soon the dance of death would begin. A small armoured vehicle came out of the valley and headed towards Hill 140. Soon it reached its highest point. It was a trophy British armoured car, which we used to transmit reports. The clap of gunfire broke the morning silence as an enemy tank fired at the armoured car from a position among the trees. I, holding my breath, watched the unexpected development of events. The armoured car drove in a southerly direction and raced across the field at a dizzying speed. Soon it was already out of range of enemy tank fire. I watched this confrontation in utter amazement. How could this enemy tank be on the hill? With the thought that something was wrong, I rushed to the telephone and called Wunsch. Wunsch had already raised the alarm his tanks and waited for the return of SS Obersturmführer Metzel, who had to establish contact with the task force Waldmüller. Metzel reported, "There are no German forces on the hill. There are enemy tanks on the hill." I got a chill inside. If this report is true, then the entire Waldmüller battle group and divisional escort company lost. It could be true. One thing was certain, they still hadn't made themselves known. Metzel drove his armoured vehicle back to get a more accurate picture of the enemy. Just as he came over the ridge, his vehicle was hit. He ejected through the open hatch and was immediately surrounded by enemy infantry and taken prisoner. Reconnaissance soon clarified the situation. The enemy battle group had occupied a dominant height over the valley of the Liesen River and could now shoot the entire area. This threat had to be eliminated immediately if we were going to hold this line for the rapidly approaching 85th Infantry Division. The Liesen River frontier was the only option for a successful defense north of Falaise. The situation demanded quick action. The high ground must be ours again. With the exception of Krause's battle group, which did not even have the combat strength of a company, and was in position east of Hill 140 and Hill 183. Not a single German soldier was in the vicinity, and there were only a couple of our tanks on the main Falaise road. The defence of Falaise was again inadequate to the developing situation. Wunsch shouted a few words to his battle-hardened tank crew and pointed to Hill 190. We decided to attack it with several TV Tiger tanks from the west and 15 TV Panther tanks from the east. While the Tigers slowly drove out of the woods and approached the crest of the height, the Panthers rolled with a clang along the road in the valley toward Krause's section of the defence, driving into its limits. During the advance of the two tank groups, the height was covered by artillery and mortar fire. Our only battery of 88 guns waited for their targets in vain. The enemy tanks did not risk to stick out from behind the crest of the height, but here came two Tigers to the firing position. They sneaked through the undergrowth unnoticed by the enemy and found themselves on his flank. The first 88 shells burst from the barrels, and immediately two Shermans exploded with a rumble. The enemy began firing on the Tigers they had spotted. 5 Tigers participated in the battle and literally nailed the enemy. Our tanks preferred to suppress the enemy from afar with fire, using the advantage in firepower. More and more enemy tanks were catching fire. The smoke heralding this was rising into the sky. I was with a section of Tigers and suddenly saw the first Panthers Jurgensen. Now the enemy tanks had a very bad time. Death and destruction fell on them and from the east. Suppressing his superior firepower ensured our success. On every bush, on every suspicious place, shells of our tanks fell. The fire of tank guns covered the entire height. Clouds of smoke, one after another, merged together. We could hardly believe that each cloud heralded the death of a tank. The absence of infantrymen kept us from reaching the tree-covered north slope of the ridge. 2 motorcycle companies of the 85th Infantry Division were expected at any moment. Just then we spotted fighter planes in the sky. Did they want to attack us, or did they have other objectives? I was worried about our tanks. They were in the open and looked like targets at a firing range. In the blink of an eye, the planes were already over us. Here was the first fighter plane arcing and then swooping down on a Canadian battle group. The planes flew over us, made a turn and again attacked the Canadian battle tanks. None of the planes attacked a Tiger or Panther. Within seconds, the hill was shrouded in smoke from the exploding tanks. Tigers and Panthers took advantage of the chaos and seized the height. It looked like a graveyard of tanks. At about 11, in Zero, I saw 2 half-tracked armoured vehicles jump out of the forest and rush north. The Tiger closest to me opened fire, but the armoured vehicles managed to hide in the thick bushes, and then they were already far away. Judging from the prisoner's testimony, one of the half-tracked vehicles was driven by Lieutenant Colonel A. J. Hay of the Algonquin Regiment, the commander of the Canadian Battle Group. Lieutenant Colonel D.G. Washington was killed in action in the afternoon. The tanks, along with the motorized companies of the newly approached 85th Infantry Division, were following the Canadian-built road in the woods and applying increasing pressure on the Canadian positions. In this critical situation, taking advantage of the psychological effect on the Canadians of the air attack, Obersturmführer Meitzel offered those who had taken him prisoner to surrender to the Germans. Meitzel broke his arm in a fall as he threw himself from his burning armoured vehicle. Along with the Canadians, he was in the very centre of the inferno that unfolded on the north slope of the heights. The Canadians tied Meitzel up, but treated him chivalrously. His first offer was politely declined. However, when air attack and artillery fire began to inflict more and more damage on the Canadian infantry, the offer was accepted. Meitzel brought 21 Canadian soldiers and 2 officers to Krause's battle group positions. About 3 p.m. He arrived at division headquarters with 23 Canadians and J.A. Renwick of the 28th Tank Regiment. For about half an hour I talked with Renwick about the abnormality of this war. He made a good impression. Renwick said nothing about the battle then taking place. On the basis of interrogations of prisoners and analysis of the questions Meitzel was asked when he was a prisoner, the following picture of the emerging situation emerged. Our counterattack in the afternoon of August 8 stopped the enemy attack. He then went on the defensive, in particular the 1st Polish Panzer Division at Saint-Cyr, Vin and the 4th Canadian Panzer Division at Sintu to regain the initiative. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division conducted a night attack of Hill 195 northwest of Pottigny, with the 28th Armoured Regiment and 2 infantry regiments. The result was to capture the passage between Licon and Les and the possibility of a rapid breakthrough to Falaise. As a result of an error in orientation in the conditions of the night, the battle group, instead of height 195, came to height 140, and in the absence of our forces there, occupied it. Meitzel was asked about a large paved road which the Canadians searched in vain. The enemy tank group passed Waldmüller's battle group, which had withdrawn from Sintu to occupy height 140. Waldmüller headed in an easterly direction and waited for darkness to reach our positions. The divisional escort company, which the Poles passed by, was in a similar situation. Throughout the night, the surviving Canadians fought their way to the 1st Polish Armoured Division. The 28th Canadian Tank Regiment left 47 tanks hit on the battlefield. Almost all of them were hit by the guns of the Tigers and Panthers. We did not lose a single tank. Our successes in defence during the previous 48 hours had cost us heavy losses, although they were less than those of the enemy. On August 9, we saw our brave comrade Michael Whitman lead his last tank attack. Moving ahead of his tanks, he and his loyal crew destroyed several Shermans east of Sintu. Then he led his tank squad forward. His rapid tank attack apparently slowed the 4th Canadian Panzer Division's attack and allowed the German troops defending along the Liesen River to buy time and gain room to maneuver. Michael Whitman died as he lived, a brave yet cold-blooded warrior who always set an example for his soldiers. He displayed a true Prussian attitude toward his duty until his death. Engulfed in flames, his Tiger marked the last battle and the end of a good comrade and soldier. However, the spirit of this brave officer continued to live on in his young tankers, who, just like their former commander, fought bravely to the end and died heroically. Krause's battle group in the battle for the bridgehead at Thuriaka suffered catastrophic losses. It now had the fighting power of a weak infantry company. During the night, Waldmüller's battle group and the divisional escort company reached our positions and occupied their own section of the defence. Waldmüller's battle group also now had the fighting strengths of just a weak company. If only the 85th Infantry Division had time to replace us on the line of defence, the survivors of the 12th Panzer Division could hardly hold on any further. One more attack by the Canadians would lead to disaster. We were already in no condition to fight. The last 10 weeks had drained us of all our juices. Completely exhausted, the soldiers fell to the ground and fell asleep. But even that night we could not rest. A tornado of fire swept over Hill 195 and rained down on Obertier's positions. Tracer shells of our tanks hit the attacking enemy infantry. The deafening bursts of hand grenades, mixed with the furious shouts of the defending German soldiers, shook off our heavy sleep. Argyll and Sutherland's regiment of Highlanders was attacking Hill 195. When I reached the height, Obuter was among his soldiers and leading them in a counterattack. The enemy had broken through our heavily dispersed defensive positions and was about to take the entire height. The soldiers of our motorized units attacked the enemy troops with a sudden blow and drove them back into the darkness. The height could be held with the support of tanks providing cover. The enemy suffered heavy losses, and by dawn was open to flank fire from our tanks in the woods near Keeney. His attack on this key section of our defences failed. The German troops, small in numbers, were able to resist the far superior enemy forces. After the unsuccessful attack of Hill 195, the Allied offensive was continued a few hours later by the forces of the 1st Polish Armoured Division at Mézières. The Polish Armoured Division attempted to force the Liesen River at Condé, outflanking Krause's battle group. The forward tanks were stopped by a single German anti-tank gun. 9 Polish tanks were left standing in front of the German anti-tank gun. They burned until morning, but the fatal shot of the tank cannon by direct fire destroyed also the calculation of our anti-tank gun. After the destruction of this single anti-tank gun, the way for the Polish division was open. There were simply no more troops ready to prevent the crossing of the Liesen. But also the Poles, after the losses suffered, decided to shift the direction of the strike to the north. Our tanks, which were at height 195, had to redeploy in great haste to the right flank of the division to attack the advancing Poles from the flank. Half a dozen tanks rushed eastward. Would they make it? We were lucky. A company of self-propelled artillery units under SSV Obersturmführer Hurdelbrink had just pulled up and came into contact with the advancing Polish lead units. This was the company's first combat contact with the enemy using the newly received tank fighter. 40 Polish tanks were destroyed in a short time. SS Obersturmführer Hurdelbrink personally hit 11 tanks. The breakthrough was prevented. During the day of August 11, the division's right wing was replaced by units of the 85th Infantry Division. Krause's battle group could finally leave its position. However, before Waldmüller's battle group could hand over its section, our tank group was attacked by the 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade in the woods near Kania. This attack was also repulsed with heavy Canadian casualties. On August 12th, the 12th Armoured Division was able to hand the 85th Infantry Division the area near Potigny. About 100 young soldiers, completely exhausted and exhausted in previous battles, resisted the enemy, having an overwhelming advantage in manpower and equipment. 2 fresh tank divisions and 1 infantry brigade could not break the will to resist 17 or 18-year-old soldiers and crush them. In books published after the war, the failure of the II Canadian Corps is attributed to the presence of defensive positions deep in the German defences and a significant number of anti-aircraft batteries of the IEI Anti-Aircraft Artillery Corps under Lieutenant General Pickett. This argument is incorrect. Yes, A position consisting of single trenches was indeed prepared along a line stretching from Saint-Sylvain to Bretteville-sur-Lizay. It was to be used as a reserve position by the 89th Infantry Division in the event of a planned withdrawal. However, the course of battle on August 8 shows, even the layman, that the use of the prepared position was impossible. Who could have occupied this position? Maybe a few hundred soldiers from Waldmüller's battle group. This so-called position did not affect the course of the battle in any way. There were simply not enough troops to occupy it. Moreover, it should be noted that the units of the II Anti-Aircraft Artillery Corps were scattered all along the front in Normandy, and its guns were used mainly against enemy bomber formations. In the entire section of the 12th SS Panzer Division, from the beginning of the invasion to the Falaise sack against enemy tanks, not a single gun of the II Anti-Aircraft Artillery Corps was used. I saw the last battery of the corps on the morning of August 8 south of Bretteville-sur-Lez. This battery was moving into position west of Falaise. The 88M guns could certainly serve well in the anti-tank role, but they were under the control of the Luftwaffe and not under the control of combat divisions. Our Canadian corps failed to achieve success because the commanders of the two divisions conducting the attack were inexperienced and used their tanks in an uncoordinated and indecisive manner. An experienced tank commander would have led the 4th Canadian Armoured Division to victory within the first day of Operation Totalize. The uncoordinated attacks of August 9 and 10 were as inexplicable as the uncertain offensive of August 8. Our division took up defensive positions between Perrier and Falaise. Several Tigers from the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion were placed under the operational control of the 85th Infantry Division and operated on both sides of the Pottigny. The situation on the western flank of the front in Normandy was not known to me in its entirety, but it seemed necessary that the front should have been pushed immediately to the scene. The commander-in-chief of the forces in the west had neither the troops nor the equipment to conduct containment operations. It was becoming impossible to oppose the enemy divisions armed with the latest technology, exsanguinated by German divisions on carts. Where this had not already been done, the headquarters and personnel of the exsanguinated divisions, as well as rear units, were transferred to the areas of Evry and Bern. Preparations were made to move fire support units to the east bank of the Seine. The surviving officers and soldiers from Waldmüller's battle group joined Kraus's battle group. The division's combat strength on August 13 was as follows: 20 armoured fighting vehicles, 1 platoon of grenadiers on armoured personnel carriers, 1 reconnaissance platoon, 300 grenadiers without combat vehicles, 1 battery of 88 mm anti-aircraft guns with 4 guns, 1 battery of self-propelled 37mm anti-aircraft guns of 9 guns, 1 company of self-propelled 20mm anti-aircraft guns, 3 batteries of heavy field howitzers, 1 battery of 105mm guns. Range of artillery positions, because of the lack of tractors, turned into a shuffle. Since the previous day, the division had not received any ammunition, and its firepower could not be fully utilized. The full strength of the division was represented by 500 enlisted men of rank and file, non-commissioned officers and officers. We all knew that the fighting would only end in death or capture, but no one was going to stop fighting. The idea of unconditional surrender, formulated in the communique of the Casablanca Conference, kept us motivated to continue the fight. Germany had lost the war, of course, but the front had to be held. The Allies had to be in no doubt that the absurd decision to demand unconditional surrender would not go away, and that another basis for negotiating peace had to be found. My comrades were not fanatics. They wanted to live and, if possible, to return home in good health. No, it was not the fanaticism so often announced by the enemy which compelled us to continue fighting. We did not throw down our arms because we still believed we had to fight for our fatherland. The division received a rough picture of the current situation during August 13. The German armies were in a situation that was not suitable for defence. A huge sack of doomed German divisions had formed between Argentan in the south, Falaise in the north, Trenne and Chamboy in the east. Throy's total annihilation was seen quite clearly. The jaws of death were about to close. The only way of retreat was through the Trenne, skirting the high ground. But the road was no longer able to receive all the troops and guarantee their departure. The hastily formed infantry divisions with artillery and auxiliary units on horse-drawn vehicles were the greatest obstacle to the still mobile tank formations. The disaster continued to unfold. On the night of August 13-14, we were finally able to sleep. It was the last relatively quiet night for many of my comrades with their companions. The muffled noise of the battle raging to the west kept us awake for a long time, but nature eventually took its course. On the morning of August 14, Wanshir Krause Obuter and I moved to an area northwest of Falaise to take up new positions. Hill 159 north of Falaise dominated the terrain, and we immediately occupied it, establishing a number of strongpoints. A number of other specific features of the terrain east of Hill 159 down to the Dieppe River were characteristic of our front. We did not believe in the peaceful intentions of the Canadians and immediately began to strengthen our strongholds. Based on an assessment of the situation as a whole and taking into account the nature of the terrain, an Allied attack was to be expected between Jort and Falaise. The Canadians occupied the front in the northern part of the planned cauldron. Its southern part was formed by the Americans at Argentan. The deadly struggle of the two German armies will begin as soon as the two ends of the pincers meet. It was with the certainty of this that I prepared the soldiers and officers of our once proud division for the decisive battle. I was not surprised when my brave comrades took my considerations for granted. They had experienced a similar crisis once before and knew exactly what the result would be. The same situation as before. We had to experience around 14.0. Hundreds of Halifax and Lancaster bombers turned the 85th Infantry Division's position into a graveyard. More and more bombers and fighter attack planes, diving, attacked the 85th Infantry Division, breaking the backbone of the defence. Artillery and anti-tank defensive positions were destroyed by bombs or blinded by smoke screens. The ground attack on the 85th Infantry Division's positions was led by the 1st Polish Armoured Division, the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. The Ire Canadian Tank Corps lined up as if on parade, tank to tank. They were waiting for the commander's signal. They intended to break through the German defensive positions with an all-destroying onslaught tactic. It was a mystery why the Canadians had chosen such an inflexible battle formation, instead of leading their tanks to approach the enemy in a spread-out formation, allowing them to make effective use of their guns and room for maneuver to crush the positions and make a quick and deep rush into the enemy's rear. These steel monsters rolled clumsily and sluggishly across the terrain. Precious time was lost as the tanks crossed the terrain adjacent to the Liesen River, for there was no way they could traverse the marshy floodplain in such a clumsy battle formation. The Canadian divisions, well equipped and armed with modern combat equipment, were still north of their attack targets on the evening of the day of the attack. Even during this phase of the operation, Canadian armoured vehicles were used as infantry support. Neither the tremendous firepower of so many tanks nor their speed was effectively utilised. The Canadian leadership failed to be creative in planning and executing the operation. In none of the Canadian attacks could the talent of a great commander be seen. Their planning was always stuck at the level of war of attrition tactics. Elimination of the defending German divisions was never achieved by an effective breakthrough. As soon as the attacking lead units encountered enemy resistance, the forward units lost momentum and began wasting energy on small, scattered battles. The course of the battle confirmed my earlier observations. Toward evening, the first wave of Canadian tanks finally rushed into the sparse strip of our defences north of Falaise. The attack by the 4th Canadian Armoured Division and the 3rd Infantry Division was smothered in front of the remnants of our once powerful division. The attack of the two divisions failed, unable to break the high morale of the 500 soldiers of the 12th S Panzer Division. Height 159 remained in the hands of a handful of German soldiers. During the night I toured all the strongholds of our front and explained the position of our two armies to the young soldiers. They now knew that they were defending the northern flank of the neck of the sack, and their holding of our positions made it possible to withdraw the exhausted units. At dawn, 20 to 30 surviving soldiers of the 85th Infantry Division reached the positions on Hill 159 and voluntarily joined the soldiers who held the defence here. This group had passed the enemy outposts during the night. We drove up in our passenger car to several soldiers, among whom there was one wounded. They shook hands with us. The Canadians renewed their attack, and soon Height 159 was in flames. Shell after shell struck the ground, blasting it into the air. Our tanks spread out in an ambush. They waited for the appearance of dark outlines of enemy combat vehicles, which would soon appear from the dense veil of smoke and dust. The first enemy tanks were already burning. His infantry was pinned to the ground by accurate machine gun bursts. Do we have enough nerves? Have we not yet lost our human form? Every now and then we looked back at the wall of fire from the bursting shells. We could no longer hear the bursts, explosions, and howls of ricocheting shells. However, any movement in that wall made us hold our breath. What if now a tank armada emerged from the wall of fire? What if yesterday's spectacle was repeated? Would we not find ourselves in the next few seconds under the clanking tank tracks? Nothing like that happened. The enemy tanks kept their distance and did not come at us. They stopped in front of Height 159. The enemy attacked again at Jort and Perrières, trying to break through and cross the River de Vive. The few of our tanks still ready to fight were thrown into the areas most threatened, and the attack was stopped. The 3rd Battalion, 12th S Artillery Regiment contributed much to our success. It accidentally discovered a small ammunition depot at Falaise and soon had no shortage of ammunition. The positions north of Falaise were still in the hands of German soldiers. It was still a long way to sunrise, but we expected more enemy attacks east of Falaise. We did not understand the enemy. Why does he spend such a huge amount of bombs and shells on the weak remnants of the 12th Panzer Division and his tanks, which were many times the number of our tanks? It was enough just to drive at us at full speed to finish us off. But nothing of the sort happened. All attacks during the first half of the day were repulsed. During the fighting around Hill 159, the commander of the 2nd Battalion of the 12th SE Tank Regiment, S. Sturm Banfara Prinz, was killed. Once again before my eyes a true warrior and friend completed his combat journey. Prinz was with me on all fronts since 1940. He died under artillery fire. Fighter planes were dive-bombing a shallow patch of woods near Bois du Roissy, firing rockets into the now long-abandoned forest. Several of our tanks east of Hill 159 fell victim to attacks by Hawker Typhoon fighters. I met Max Wanshi between Versenville and High 159. He informed me of the hopeless situation on the hill. Enemy tanks were rushing at us. Their cannon shells were tearing up the road. Max Wanshi was out of sight. I felt a searing pain. Blood was running down my face, and ducked my head behind a small hedge. The shrapnel had bare my skull. I looked at the road, dizzy. Our car had disappeared, and Max Wunsch was no longer in sight. I was alone, but by no means did I feel abandoned. I knew that my comrades would not leave me. The tanks were coming closer and closer. I crawled along the ditch to get away from the direction of movement of enemy fighting vehicles. The Shermans were operating against several German tanks that had taken up a convenient position on the opposite slope. This was apparently the work of Max Wunsch. Tank shells whizzed over my head. Max Wunsch was back. Under cover of tank fire, he was rushing down the road to pick me up. I waved desperately at him. The road was screened and shot at by the enemy for its entire length. Shells were tearing around Max, but that didn't stop him. He held the steering wheel firmly in his hands. I was waiting in the ditch, ready to jump into the car. With lightning speed, we were back on the opposite slope. Wunsch was cheering me on. He was directing the tank's fire. I continued to fight with a half-shaved head and a couple of stitches. Bill 159, so desperately defended, fell in the afternoon. The survivors withdrew back to the OT section. SS Obersturmführer Hauck, commander of an armoured vehicle reconnaissance unit, reported an attack by the 1st Polish Panzer Division at Zor. The Poles again attempted to make their way to the Div crossing, but so far all their attacks had been repulsed. Parts of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division entered Falaise towards evening. The 6th Brigade under Brigadier General H. Young was finally able to capture the town of William the Conqueror. Fighting in the ruins of the completely destroyed city continued. The division broke out of the encirclement after nightfall and withdrew to positions near Ussy. The new front line ran from Morteau-Coulibet through Dambinville to Falaise. On August 17, new Polish Panzer Division attacks on Jort began. The 3rd Company of the 12th SS Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion was almost destroyed. The commander, SS Untersturmführer Hartwig, was mortally wounded. The rest of the artillerymen retreated with the battery in an easterly direction. The enemy had crossed the Divide and was advancing to the southeast. At this point, the 1st Polish Armoured Division was not opposed by a single cohesive fighting unit. The road to Tren and Chamboy was open to the Poles. The Falaise bag could be tied. SS Obersturmführer's intelligence unit was destroyed towards evening. He himself was wounded and taken prisoner, but was able to escape and report to the division about the threat from a large enemy tank force wedged deep into our right flank in the direction of Tren. About 60 soldiers of the division were still tied up in the heavy, brutal fighting at Falaise. These soldiers, exhausted after continuous fighting since June 6, were fighting against the 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade. The 2 Tigers were the backbone of the defence, but the soldiers already bore the stamp of death. That evening 2 Grenadiers, chosen by lot, none of their comrades wanted to leave the group, delivered the last report and news from the brave unit. The whole of it perished shortly after midnight, amid the ruins of the school of École Supérieure. The remnants of the division held the defence on the line of Div D, T and SEE. At Nessy, 2 damaged Tigers prevented the armoured vehicles of the lead units of the British 53rd Infantry Division from advancing. In August 19 at about 2:00. Both turned me put out of action. SS Obersturmführer Mietzel and other surviving soldiers were taken prisoner. All Tigers crew members were wounded. During the night of August 18-19, we abandoned the last mobile radio station and all other vehicles of secondary importance. We only left a few passenger cars, armoured personnel carriers and track. The command post at Nizi was captured by enemy tanks and infantry shortly before sunrise. My liaison fell, a bullet hit him in the stomach. We took the young soldier with us, taking advantage of the morning twilight, together with the remnants of Krause's battle group. We fought our way south and took a new line of defence southeast of the railroad tracks. During the night, Munch's battle group ran into advancing enemy units. Most of the battle group's personnel were wounded and taken prisoner. Max Wunschy and 2 other officers were captured 6 days later. We were confronted with suffering, indifference to the cruel, tragic fate of the encircled men. By mid-afternoon, the commander of the Alexexiv Army Corps, General Elfeld, and his Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel von Kriegen, appeared at our command post. Our division no longer had any communication with higher headquarters. The personnel of the 85th Infantry Division had separated from the corps. As a result, General Elfeld had to command only the remnants of the 12th Panzer Division. The suffering we saw around us was simply prohibitive. Refugees and soldiers of the defeated German armies were helpless before the bombers, constantly flying overhead. It was impossible to take cover from the explosions of shells and bombs concentrated in such a tight space. We were excellent targets for the enemy air forces. The wooded areas were filled with wounded soldiers and horse corpses. Death hung over us at every turn. We were like targets on a firing range. The guns of the 4th Canadian and 1st Polish Armoured Divisions could take us in their sights. It was impossible to miss. By chance, in an orchard a kilometre southwest of Tren, we came across the 7th Army Command Post. General Elfeld and I headed for the Army headquarters. The roads were impassable. They were clogged with motorized units and the carts of the infantry division on the goose steer. Burning vehicles and exploding ammunition marked the road. We ran, stumbled and jumped over, scrambling to make our way to headquarters. The area was under continuous artillery fire. The mass of fighters storming the road had multiple targets. We found the 7th Army headquarters in a trench behind a farm. Our esteemed Waffen SS Colonel General Hauser was sitting on the edge of the trench studying a map. With the commander was his chief of staff, Colonel von Gersdorf, Lieutenant Colonel von Kluge of the General Staff, and Major Guderian of the General Staff. Exploded ammunition truck sent us their greetings. Colonel von Gersdorf was wounded. The issuance of orders continued. The colonel stayed with General Hauser gave orders to break through the advancing night. The tank battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division was to go for a breakthrough at dawn at Chambois, and the 3rd Parachute Division was to break through at Saint-Lam, ER after midnight. At first it was not to use weapons. The remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division were to hold the northwestern edge of the Sac until midnight, and then join the 3rd Parachute Division. We said goodbye to the commander with a final handshake. He looked at us seriously with his only healthy eye. He had lost his other eye in the battle near Moscow. We rushed again through the hail of shells and took shelter at Quarry. Many German soldiers lay huddled together against its steep walls. They were waiting for the coming of the saving night to escape from this hell. From a direct hit of a shell on a group of infantrymen near us, several soldiers were mortally wounded. One field officer lost his right leg above the knee. We quickly dragged him closer to the wall. Shouts calling for a medic were drowned in the din of artillery fire. We found the commander of the I Parachute Corps, General Meindl, and the commander of the 3rd Parachute Division, Lieutenant General Skimpf, in one of the houses. The parachutists discussed with us the upcoming night breakthrough. The 3rd Parachute Division was to be supported by 2 Tigers. We reached our command post completely exhausted. Commanding the division during the breakthrough was an almost impossible endeavour. The roads were completely clogged, and there were no longer any means of communication. The division broke into 2 groups. The motorized units that still existed were to break through behind the 1st SS Panzer Division through Chambois. This group was to be commanded by the Divisional Artillery Commander Drexler. The division headquarters, joined by General Elfeld and the remnants of Krause's battle group, were to follow the Parachute and Airborne Division. I broke our group into several smaller ones so that they could operate independently if necessary. The guns, for which there were not enough tractors, were blown up at midnight. At midnight, I gathered everyone who was still surrounded around a group of farmhouses. The liaison group was with the 3rd Parachute Division. Since the reconnaissance unit had not returned and no noise of battle could be heard from Lambert, we decided that the parachutists' breakthrough had been successful. We began General Elfeld. Lieutenant Colonel von Kriegern and Hubert Meyer followed with the advanced unit. I drove in the direction of Chambois. We had to move over rough terrain if we wanted to make our way forward. The few roads and trails available were impassable. They were hopelessly clogged. Enemy artillery was opening a harassing fire. Everywhere were the fiery flashes of bursting enemy shells. In all directions flew bright lights that exploded our ammunition. Exhausted German soldiers wandered back and forth. The confusion in the bag of encirclement made it impossible to choose the exact direction of movement. By dawn, we were west of Chambois and joined up with a tank battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division, which was just about to launch an attack. We joined it as infantry. I jumped onto the armour of the tank and, in order to climb up, grabbed the belt of a comrade who was lying behind the turret. I was terrified and let him go. The soldier was dead. He had been killed by shrapnel. The attackers were under fire from enemy anti-tank guns, tanks and artillery. I had no means of communication. Our tanks, hesitating, retreated under enemy fire. He again concentrated behind willow bushes near the eroded bed of the Divai. The river here was about 2 meters deep and 3 to 4 meters wide. We witnessed a terrible tragedy. The galloping horses, along with the wagon and drivers, fell into the dried-up creeks, and men floundered in the mud of the almost waterless creek. Frustrated, the soldiers climbed onto the wreckage and were literally torn apart by Canadian artillery shells. Several hundred prisoners lay helplessly under the fire of their own guns. They could not escape from the encirclement. After forcing the Diva between Chamboy and Tren, I assembled an infantry unit. The whole area was strewn with dead and dying German soldiers. The enemy was on the slopes and was firing continuously at the SAC. Most of the casualties belonged to infantry division support units that had remained in the SAC with their gudgeon transports. Guided by no one, they fled for their lives. General Elfeld and Lieutenant Colonel von Kriegen were missing. They were not at the assembly point. To restore order to the now swollen group, I ordered the soldiers to assemble under the cover of a farmhouse, while in our neighborhood columns of unarmed soldiers marched toward the enemy. Many officers and unarmed soldiers joined my group, but only those who managed to find weapons were allowed to march with us. Most of them obeyed. In Tren and Chamboy, I knew every tree and every bush. Parts of my regiment had been in both localities before the invasion. I became at the head of the group. Bernhard Kraus led the other half of it. The total strength of our force amounted to 200 men. Hubert Meyer, Sessi Obersturmführer Kaun, and my faithful Michael were with me. We were to follow through the Tren-Chamboy road. Enemy tanks were moving on the road in both directions. Our tanks, which were in the SAC, could not cross the Dieppe and could not give us support. The river was too deep. Many dead soldiers lay behind bushes and garden walls. They were all running towards the waiting guns of the 4th Canadian Armoured Division. Would we be able to break through this iron ring of encirclement? The enemy had taken the high ground and was firing on the roads and fields. Michael removed the white bandage from my head, a brave Cossack from Dnipropetrovsk. The bandage is no good, I'll make a new one later. He thought that white bandages made me conspicuous. I was jumping from cover to cover with a pistol in my hand. The trenches were full of dead men. Apparently they had been dealt with by the tanks. Looted vehicles stood in fields and behind fences. We fought our way closer and closer to the slope as the bullets fired from a machine gun whistled above us. We fell to the ground between 2 tanks. They were about 150 meters apart and were firing at the SAC. A machine-gunned armoured personnel carrier was tearing back and forth to our right. Suddenly it disappeared, and we rushed between the 2 tanks in an easterly direction with the speed of a cannon shot. Machine gun fire mowed down our ranks, but we were unstoppable. We crushed the Canadian infantry in a matter of seconds. All this happened almost completely silent. Only the whistle of shells flying overhead and explosions could be heard. We were soon to break through the enemy barrier. I could go no farther. Sweat stung my inflamed eyes. The wound on my head opened, but I could not stop. We had to break through. Suddenly a Sherman tank appeared 30 meters to my right. Hubert Meyer called out to me. I ran almost directly at the tank's gun. We were rushing, making like weasels incredible jumps and leaps. The greenery obscured us from the enemy. I could go no further. The last few days had taken too much strength from me. Hubert Meyer took command and urged everyone to keep moving. Soon everyone followed past me. Sessi Obersturmführer Cologne and Michael remained with me. The machine gun bursts whistled over our heads. Tears were running down Michael's face. He couldn't drag me fast enough. He cheered me up like a mother to a child. Every now and then I heard, "Commander, let's go. Commander, let's go. Only a few hundred meters left. Please, Commander, let's go." They were advancing through the field alone. I had given up trying to seek cover or double jump. Now I slowly dragged myself in an easterly direction and eventually fell into a ditch. My comrades were already lying there waiting for me. We crawled across the road and made our way to a ridge stretching from Chamboy to the northeast. Without saying a word, we looked at the SAC behind us and mentioned in an unkind word, the men who had so recklessly sacrificed the remnants of the two German armies. We had been discussing the possibility of shortening the front line, which had to be withdrawn to the Seine River, even after the loss of Caen. We believed that a preemptive evacuation from western France to positions along the Seine was possible. Beyond the Seine, the infantry divisions could prove useful, and the armoured divisions could be given time to rest and resupply. We continued to march along the ridge, occasionally exposed to artillery fire. With complete ignorance of the situation, we had no hope of connecting with our units until we were on the other side of the Seine. However, south of Vimoutiers, we came across a combat escort of the 2nd Reconnaissance Battalion of the SS Reach Motorized Division. At the command post of the Germania Grenadier Motorized Regiment, we were told that the regiment and other formations were involved in an attack in the Chambois area to break the encirclement ring. The initial attack with small forces failed, but on August 21 it was successful. The encirclement front was broken through. Up to half of the encircled German troops managed to get out of the Falaise bag. The rest were captured. Before the attack, I had the opportunity to bring to the attention of the regiment important information about the situation. Part of the motorized division group was able to slip out of the sack in the afternoon of 20 August. Other units did so the next day. The artillerymen lost several of their heavy guns. A battery of 37 mm guns managed to fight its way through with almost no casualties. SS Sturmbannführer SS Pandel, commander of the 12th Signal Battalion, was killed while attempting to salvage a valuable communications vehicle. The Battle of Normandy was over. German soldiers had once again accomplished the seemingly impossible. They did not deserve the terrible defeat in the Falaise sack. The officers, non-commissioned officers, and young soldiers of the front line had done their duty to the end. The defeat could not be blamed on the front line soldiers. The bitter cup they had to drink, having received it from the hands of political players. The way the German soldier showed himself in Normandy will be forever written in the history books. And here is our former enemy's assessment. The only guys who really deserved medals in this war, said one Allied infantry soldier, were the SS guys. Every one of them deserved a medal for bravery. They were a gang of bad guys, but always real soldiers. They acted in such a way that our guys looked like amateurs compared to them. There are few other such divisions, both Allied and German, that could surpass the battlefield achievements of the 12th SS Panzer Division in Normandy. I have mentioned many times that Canadian commanders were very indecisive and only attacked with vastly superior forces. This was especially true of their actions in Operations Totalize and Operation Trajectable. During these operations, the Canadians not only lost the initiative on the battlefield, but also all chances of completely destroying the defeated German armies. After August 4, the II Canadian Corps fought only against the 12th SS Panzer Division. Our division barely reached the fighting strength of a battalion, but precious time was lost to the Canadians. The single Canadian division would have been enough to hold the northern flank of the sack and put pressure on the German troops there. The three remaining divisions of the II Canadian Corps, including two superbly technically equipped tank divisions, could close the sack at Trèves and Chambois at the latest on August 16. Our units would then be in a position where they would hardly be able to break the encirclement ring. If the Canadians had done so, our offensive in Ardennes in December 1944, in all probability, would not have taken place. The tank divisions, which were the decisive force in that offensive, could not have been reconstituted in such a negligible time unless a corps of veteran personnel had broken through the ring of battle between Trèves and Falaise. It is my opinion that it was possible to break out of the encirclement, mainly because of the indecision and hesitation of the Canadian command. I believe the Allies came to the same conclusion regarding the 4th Canadian Armoured Division when they made the change of command. But the blame was not to be laid at Kitching's feet alone. The Canadians could not have been ignorant of the character of their enemy. They had pretty good intelligence, and aerial reconnaissance was always at its best. The commander of the advanced battalion, Major D.W. Curry, went to St. Lambert-sur-Dive as early as August 19, thus blocking the only way out of the Falaise bag. This battalion acted brilliantly. Its dead and surviving soldiers deserve our respect. I arrived at the SSI Tank Corps on the afternoon of August 20 with the part of the division that had broken through. We were greeted with joy and gratitude. There they thought we were no longer alive. I could not stand it and cried. While making my report, I remembered that thousands of my comrades now rest in the soil of Normandy. A summary of the situation said that there was no stable front west of the Seine, but also to the east of it no lines of defence existed. The prospects were disastrous, and we could pin our hopes only on the western wall. I was pleased to hear that those units of the division, which had been withdrawn from the front line even earlier and withdrawn for rest and replenishment, had delayed the enemy on the line Lille-La, Verneuil-sur-Avre, Druex, and thus prevented the formation of a new sack west of the Seine. These formations acted completely independently. SS Sturmbannführer Gerd Bremer was awarded for this with oak leaves to the Knight's Cross. The personnel of the division headquarters, moving through Limnibourg, reached Louviers. From there he would command the combat-ready units of the division. The rest of the division fought as a mobile rearguard against American tank formations advancing northward from Druex and Verdun. Meanwhile, German troops, having broken out of the Falaise sack, forced the Seine near Rouen. The personnel crossed the Seine at Elbeuf without losses. I arrived in Rouen with a report to the Commander-in-Chief of Troops in the West Field Marshal model. Field Marshal had no illusions about the situation and spoke of the need to have 35 to 40 divisions, since we all knew that 40 divisions on the Western Front was not. Then, again and again, our thoughts turned to the Western Rampart. One hastily assembled battle group held Elbeuf until August 26. After evacuating the left bank of the Seine, this battle group defended the Seine-Bend south of Rouen at Fort de la Londe, thus allowing our forces to withdraw from the battle with the enemy. Our soldiers fought the Canadian units at Fort de la Londe for the last time. They held off the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division until August 29. It was not until the afternoon that a battle group under the command of W. Monk finally made a withdrawal. After 2 days in the Beauvais area, the division withdrew to the Arson area, as rest and resupply so close to the front was impossible. We marched under cover of darkness, through the blood-stained fields of World War I, the same roads on which we had rushed in 1940 when we were advancing westward. Our marching column looked miserable, individual columns rolling into the night, each fighting vehicle taking several others in tow. At Eisen, the division came under the command of General Stumpf, commander of the armoured forces in the West, who was personally briefed on the division's personnel and the condition of the fighting vehicles. General Stumpf gave me the pleasant news that I had been awarded swords to the oak leaves of my Knight's Cross. The division immediately began to replenish and re-equip its thinning units. Military equipment was expected to come from Verdun and Metz. The losses in manpower and equipment were horrendous. Combat units lost more than 80% of the personnel with which they had begun the campaign. Combat support and supply units also suffered heavy losses, mostly from enemy aircraft. The division lost more than 80% of its tanks in combat and during the withdrawal. It lost about 70% of its armoured vehicles and armoured personnel carriers, 60% of its guns and 50% of its vehicles. Such gigantic losses could not be made up in a few days. But we had no other choice. The division had to become combat-ready as soon as possible. We did not like the Arson area or the general situation. Combat support units and units not ready for combat were immediately moved to the area east of the Meuse River. By August 31, the Americans had reached Soissons and Lana and were advancing northeast. The division task force held them at the Tun River until the night of September 1-2. In the meantime, Monk's battle group had arrived in the division. As enemy troops threatened the division from the rear, it withdrew to the east where it took up a defensive position. We had to take the fight to allow our infantry to cross the Meuse River. During the retreat to this position, the commander of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Grenadier Motorized Regiment, Erich Olbuter was mortally wounded when he hit a mine planted on the road by partisans. Both of his legs were blown off, and he died at night in the military hospital in Charleville. In Erich Olbuter, I lost another hardened warrior and old friend who had fought side by side with me since 1939. He was an assertive soldier and an ideal commander. During the night from September 1 to 2, we, together with the remnants of the 116th Panzer Division, held a defensive position near the town of Beaumont. Under enemy pressure, the division retreated through Philippeville to Florent shortly before arriving in Philippeville. The commander of the 26th SS Grenadier Motorized Regiment, SA Hauptsturmführer Heinz Schrott, was treacherously killed by partisans. The heroic struggle of the so-called partisans was nothing more than despicable, mediocre assassinations from around the corner. The organizers of the guerrilla war were real war criminals. They acted against all humanism and were guided by naked instinct. I had never had to deal with guerrilla warfare before, nor had I ever felt the notorious hatred of the French and Belgians. On the contrary, I've always witnessed good relations between the troops and the population of the occupied territories. This was especially true of the long-suffering population of Normandy. The so-called partisans raised their heads only when they did not have to fear for their personal safety and their lives. They did not fight. Instead, they treacherously and despicably killed individual members of the German army. From a military point of view, the actions of the partisans had little or no effect on the course of the war. As a result, the population that suffered most was those who did not participate in the guerrilla wars. It was not the advocates of guerrilla warfare and violators of international law who suffered. Under the same plan, they incited hatred between peoples. It has been deepening for a long time because of the criminal actions of the guerrillas. No one would deny that through their policy of supporting the guerrillas, the Allies actively planted communism in Western Europe. Without the treacherous actions of the brave partisans, there would have been no reason for war criminals' trials. We crossed the Meuse at Ivoire on September 4 to take up defensive positions across the river. The division occupied the Godin, U sector. The 2nd SS Panzer Division occupied the sector on either side of the division's combat strength was represented by about 600 infantrymen. It was divided into 2 battle groups. There were no more tanks. The tanks we had left were under repair at Luttich. There was no ammunition for the battery of heavy field howitzers and battery of 88 mm anti-aircraft. Guns were stationed at a crossroads northwest of Sponton as ground support. The Americans immediately attempted to force the Meuse at Godin-Ivoire. Their attacks were repulsed with heavy losses to them. However, they succeeded in establishing a bridgehead at Douw. The Americans took up positions there in the woods. During our counterattack, the bridgehead was reduced and was expected to be eliminated before dark on September 6. I reconnoitred and discussed the further defense of our positions on the Meuse River with Milius and Saibken. Our vehicles were frequently fired upon by forest partisans. There were no casualties on our side, but we found the bodies of 6 dead soldiers from the reconnaissance battalion from Luttich. They had been shot during a halt. The reconnaissance group had been fired upon between Sponton and the perpetrators were not found. On the night of September 5-6, the Americans succeeded in forcing the Meuse near and rebuilding the bridge, which was not completely destroyed. The commander of the unit defending Namur withdrew to the east, without informing the neighbouring units and thus opening the way to the enemy deep into our defences on the Meuse. A reconnaissance team of the 12th Cessna Reconnaissance Battalion came across the American Advance Battalion on the Namur-Signy Road at about Ilansiro. I was returning from the Saibken command post when this bad news came. It seemed incredible to me, but the report was confirmed by another reconnaissance group at 11:15 a.m. The units were immediately put on alert and ordered to withdraw behind the Urt River. The withdrawal could only be carried out at night. Speed was the decisive factor. The Americans would soon be at Durnal, and then in a matter of minutes would reach the crossroads. Our headquarters, if it wanted to get away from the Americans, had to get past this crossroads. In the blink of an eye, the headquarters was already racing toward Durnal. I led the group through a steeply rising field to reach Durnal through a section of forest. Just before arriving in Durnal, Hubert Meyer asked me to hand over command of the lead unit to Sim Absturmführer Heinz. I waved to Heinz Mann, who was riding behind, and his car caught up with us as we approached the first houses in Durnal. The town lay in a deep lowland. To the left of the road was a 1.5-foot wall, around which the road turned eastward. I stood in the car, as usual, and tried to look over the other side of the hill. As a result, I was able to see over the protruding wall to the main road to Namur. I shouted, warning Heinzmann, but it was too late. A shell had shattered the lead vehicle, and a firing American tank appeared from around the corner. The situation changed in the blink of an eye. Attacking a tank column with a couple of Volkswagens is not a picnic trip. We couldn't turn back. I looked at the tank, slowly rolling forward. From my personal experience in similar situations, I could guess that the tank commander would use this unique opportunity to capture the headquarters or destroy it with fire. There was nothing left to do but get out of the way, and as soon as possible. I jumped over the gate and the wire fence that separated the yard from the garden. But what an unpleasant surprise! I could not hide behind the row of houses. The buildings were built into the upward-sloping elevation, and we were also surrounded by a high wall. If I tried to climb the wall, I would make an excellent target for the Americans. The first thing I had to do was to find a secluded place. The chicken coop was the only option, so off I went. The body was carried over the wire. Max Bornheft had seen me before I disappeared. Now we were both trapped. At least the chicken coop hid the enemy from sight for a while. After nightfall, we hoped to make our way to our own. There were loud shouts from the road. It was the population greeting the Americans. The tanks passed by. I heard excited conversation in the nearest house, and the name Cologne. I never saw him again. Obersturmführer Cologne is still listed as missing in action. By then it was already 2 p.m. A fine rain was drizzling on the roof of the chicken coop. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening on the road. I crawled up on my belly to the wire fence, barely making it to the turn around the corner of the chicken coop. I experienced one of the most horrific moments of the entire war. Several partisans came to the fence and talked to the farmer. They probably wanted to know if he had seen any German soldiers on the farm. The farmer shook his codpiece negatively. Gritting my teeth, I lay only a few meters away from the partisans. They knew about the fence and were peering over the hill. Would these minutes become my last minutes on Earth? I clutched my gun tightly. They would not take me without a fight. The branching shrubbery was my hiding place. Screams and gunshots drew the boys' attention to a neighboring peasant's house. A comrade's life was cut short. We felt some relief. After all, the farmhouse had been searched, and maybe the rain would discourage the curious. Minutes turned into hours. We were enjoying the weather. Suddenly we were taken aback. The chickens had gathered in front of the coop and wanted to go in, but they didn't want to share their apartment with us. They wanted us to leave. Things couldn't end well, so what happened. The little old farmer stood by the fence, marveling at what was happening. Then he tried to get his poultry into the coop. However, these living things resisted. They wanted sole possession of their empire. The farmer got curious and stuck his head into the coop. He shouldn't have done that, because before he could open his mouth, he found himself sitting on an old barrel in the darkest corner. He was now the third man on the barrel. He looked at our guns in horror. We could do without our guest. The situation had become more complicated. The farmer's wife would soon join us. She, of course, would soon discover her lord and master missing and go looking for him. So we decided to set the old man free. He promised to keep his mouth shut and not to mess with the partisans. He quickly scampered away. Of course, we didn't think his word was a bank promissory note. Hardly had the old man disappeared when we climbed over the high wall and immediately landed outside the guerrilla headquarters. I hadn't counted on such an unexpected outcome. It could have ended much worse. The partisans had set up in the church boiler room, and a young lad was standing in the cellar doorway enjoying his first American cigarette. Armed to the teeth, the partisans were climbing up the stairs. We jumped, crawled, and rushed through the cemetery like weasels. Old graves and tombstones hid us, keeping us undetected. We reached a compost pile in the corner of the cemetery. Since nothing else occurred to me at that moment, I covered Max with old wreaths and asked him to watch the entrance to the church. I wanted to hide behind some bushes. A scream echoed through the cemetery. It announced that we were in a very dangerous situation. Still turning around, I saw carbines in the hands of two policemen on the church steps. The policemen were frightened, for they had not yet seen Max. I raised my gun lightning fast and pretended I was going to shoot. The policeman hid. I had to go. I rushed toward the southern edge of the cemetery, and again the muzzle of the carbine was staring at me. It was held by a man standing in the aisle and put it away as I rushed right at him, threatening him with the gun. We were surrounded. The old farmer man did get everyone to their feet. I swung over the cemetery fence, landing on the village street, which was about 4 feet away. Max, panting, followed me. Oh my God, I couldn't believe how quick you become when your life is on the line. The street was going uphill. My lungs seemed ready to burst. Bullets were whizzing over our heads. I heard Max shriek. I turned around and fired a couple shots. Max was lying on the road. He had been shot. My shots forced the brave freedom fighters to hide. I turned onto the road to the exit of the village. Just in time I noticed 2 more partisans who were on guard there. Where was I to go? I saw a small door propped only by a large stone. I hid behind it unnoticed. I sat in a corner of the stable in utter exhaustion, peeping through the door slits. The partisans appeared a few seconds later. They ran excitedly back and forth along the road and searched every bush. My disappearance was inexplicable to them, and they began to accuse each other. One of the guerrillas demanded in a loud voice that I come out of my hiding place and surrender. He promised to hand me over to the Americans and to respect international law. I did not respond to his call. The gun in my hand seemed to grow heavier and heavier. One day we swore we would never surrender alive. The harsh trials in Russia forced us to make that oath. The time had come. There was 1 cartridge left in the chamber, and the last one in the magazine. Should I hazard my oath? Did it only matter on the Eastern Front? Weren't the present circumstances completely different? The minutes passed. I looked at my gun again. I thought about my family and my unborn child. It was hard, very hard to make a decision. The guerrillas stood only a few meters from my hiding place. I studied their faces. Some were embittered. Others seemed harmless enough. Maybe they had just been handed their weapons a few seconds ago. The leader of their group asked me again to surrender. Next to him stood a boy of about 14. They were obviously father and son. The little devil was holding a carbine. The boy suddenly excitedly pointed to his father at the door, and the stone moved to one side. The man understood everything. It was dry where the stone was, so it had been moved a few minutes ago. Father again asked me to surrender. The partisans shot at the door and pulled out hand grenades. 2 more shots split the door and forced me into a corner. My gun to my father, saying, "My gun is pointed at your son. Will you keep your promise?" He immediately pulled the boy to him and repeated his promise to treat me properly. It was all over. All hope was in the counterattack of my comrades. I hurled the magazine from my pistol into one corner and the pistol itself into the other. What a terrible feeling to be taken prisoner. I slowly opened the door and went to the guerrilla commander. One of the lads pounced on me. Several pistols and carbines were pointed at me. Not a word was uttered. I paid no attention to the threats with weapons. I looked into my father's eyes. With a wave of his hand, he ordered his companions to lower their weapons. They reluctantly obeyed and accompanied us to the church. The guerrilla commander told me that he had been to Germany in World War I as a labourer, and that he had only good impressions. Consequently, he had no reason to be the ringleader of a murderous gang. However, he said that young men could sometimes be hard to keep from bloodshed and murder. Max was still lying on the road. He had a very painful bullet wound in his thigh. We dragged him to the police station, where he was immediately given an anti-tetanus shot. The village doctor was eminently friendly. He told me that he hoped we could go home soon. The two policemen then took a pair of handcuffs out of their pockets, each, and put them on my wrists. I almost fell to my knees in pain. The handcuffs were digging deeper and deeper into my flesh. The policemen looked at me expectantly. The guerrillas just stared at me with their mouths open. These two must have practiced this torture often before. They obviously expected me to scream in pain. Max looked at me and said, "Bastards!" The ringleader returned to the room and gave the order to lead me out. We waddled through the cemetery and back to the boiler room, the guerrilla base. Max was laid on a mattress of straw. In amazement, I saw two policemen open the door of the boiler room and remove their uniforms. Soon they were gone, dressed as partisans. I scolded to myself the German military field police unit that was stationed next door to the church. These guys had apparently been asleep at the wheel, and we frontline soldiers were now paying for their amateurishness. Max was in unbearable pain. He asked me again and again to contact his father if I survived. He didn't hold out much hope of surviving himself. The hours in the cellar stretched slowly. The guerrilla leader brought me some bread. He was worried. He knew that there were German troops west of the village and they would probably march through Durnal during the night. I listened to the slightest noise. From the conversations of the partisans, I gathered that the Americans were moving in the direction of Dinan and that they were not presently in Durnal. We were guarded by a very restless partisan who now and then grasped his pistol. Every time I tried to make Max comfortable, he shouted and waved his gun in front of us. The young man was scared. Why, I found out a few hours later. At midnight, the partisans suddenly separated, and only our guards remained with us. Before they left, they placed a heavy table between us and them. It divided the room into two parts. The gun was pointed at me all the time. Sometimes I had the feeling that our guards wanted to kill me. Cars drove through the village. Were they Germans or Americans? We didn't have to wait long for an answer. After another hour, I heard gunshots and exploding ammunition. Shrapnel from them whistled through the air. Probably a German car was on fire. By dawn, there was noise everywhere around us. We could clearly distinguish German machine guns from American machine guns by the sound. We strained to listen to the noise of the battle. Our guard became more and more relentless. His gun was constantly pointed at me. He even refused to give Max water. He was afraid to turn his back on us. The window panes were suddenly shattered by a machine gun burst, and the Americans demanded that we surrender. It was an interesting turn of events. A terrified guard threatened us from the corner with a gun. I had to yell at him to open the door and stop frantically firing at the Americans. The Americans kept firing. Machine gun fire was pounding the church wall. Finally, the first American began to descend the steps into the basement. In amazement, I saw a guard get a rough kick in the butt. He flew off into a corner. The guerrilla turned out to be a deserter from Lorraine. He was discouraged because the Americans were treating him like a trump. My amazement quickly faded. The machine gun rested against my stomach. At the same time, the second American shouted, "Don't resist. My buddy wants to take your medals as a souvenir." Powerless with anger, I let rip off my knight's cross. It had been with me since April 1941. The second American spoke decent German, since his mother was born in Germany. He told me, for God's sake, don't tell them who you are. Your soldiers are treated badly on the home front. I didn't realize what he meant until 24 hours later. We climbed the steps to the cemetery and came under German machine gun fire. We lay between the graves and waited for the fire to stop. Before I knew it, they had taken off my watch and rings. I had fallen into the hands of real bandits. Outside the church, my money was taken from me, and another Jai took me into custody. Angry that there was nothing more to take, he beat me on the back with the butt of his carbine. After a while, he calmed down. As we passed two frightened women standing in the doorway, I received another blow on my back. Stumbling, I took a few steps and turned around to receive a hard blow from the side of my head with the muzzle of the carbine. I collapsed to the ground. As I fell, I heard the protesting voices of the women. New blows lifted me to my feet, and I staggered across the street. The screams of the women rang in my ears. After a few more steps, a US Army pushed me into a small garden. Blood flooded my eyes and flowed from my left ear. I could think of nothing else. I saw the large currant bush in front of me that I was being pushed into. Then that would be the end of my journey. The image of the family quickly flashed before my eyes. The official report would read, "Missing in action." In reality, I would be killed and buried in an As the man raised his carbine, I looked at him with hot contempt. I no longer noticed him. I was already in another world. Suddenly, in astonishment, I saw his carbine lowered. He left me with an exclamation of "damn it," and walked away. My saviour was a young lieutenant whose mother was a German. At the last moment he intervened and stopped the soldiers' massacre. The lieutenant tried to justify the soldiers' behaviour. He said that the irresponsible propaganda campaign of the cabinet warriors was to blame for such acts of brutality. To avoid getting his car dirty, I perched myself on the fender of the car. Within seconds, the windshield was red from my blood, which got on it as we drove. After driving a bit, we stopped at an American supply convoy. There I was handed over to the head of the convoy with instructions to take me to the hospital. The convoy consisted of about 12 trucks and staff cars. Each vehicle was equipped with a machine gun, had one driver and 2 assistant drivers. With amazement, mixed with envy, I watched the soldiers being resupplied. The forward American detachment consisted of 1 tank and 1 infantry battalion, and was built as if it were going to a parade. Tank after tank and vehicle after vehicle lined up closely together in an open space. Units resupplied without taking defensive measures against either ground or air attack. 5 tigers attacking from the woods would have smashed this entire battle group to smithereens. But there were no tigers between Museus and the German border. There were only battle-weary soldiers in that area. They were retreating, crushed by fate. Will the Western Wall stop the Americans? I don't think it could. I knew there were no more divisions left to fight. The western rampart was unfinished and had long been neglected. Indeed, the Ruhr was virtually undefended, and it seemed that nothing could prevent the Allied forces from capturing this forge of German arms. One mighty throw of 10 to 15 Allied divisions into northwest Germany would break the backbone of her resistance and end the war in a few weeks. The war for Europe was Germany's to lose. The moans of another wounded German soldier brought me back to reality. He was in a neighbouring car and was wounded in the abdomen. Suddenly I saw a hand waving from a third car. It was Max. He was in a truck carrying fuel. Empty canisters served the wounded Max as a bed. Meanwhile, about 60 captured Germans had piled up. A few paratroopers, about 15 soldiers from my division and men from the Guard battalion were distributed among the trucks. The column started toward Namur toward evening of the same day. I scrutinized the road going through fields of grain crops. Understandably, I had thoughts of escape. Would such an attempt be successful? I gave the young parachutist a little push and shared my idea. He nodded and moved closer to the edge of the car. The Americans were careful. Each car was covered by a machine gun on the following car, and in addition, in each cabin sat an American with a machine gun. So only a road with many turns, which passed through a wooded area, could be considered suitable for escape. We did not have such a good chance. We arrived in Namur sooner than we thought. But the thought of escape never left us. We wanted to be free again. Namur was bustling with activity. The bridge over the Muses had been rebuilt by American engineers without much difficulty. The population either looked at us with indifference or behaved threateningly. Our column moved through the centre of town and stopped in front of a large building, which I later learned was a prison. It was next door to the train station, and curious citizens were gathered around it. Women were pointing at me. I was splattered with blood and made a pitiful impression. I saw Max Bornheft being taken off the truck, and a few minutes later being carried into the building. Partisans and policemen received him at the entrance. Gurkhas surrounded the group. Then the unbelievable happened. A gunshot rang out that turned the citizens into a furious mob. The road came alive with approving whistles, cheers, and applause. Without warning and in a split second, my battle comrade with whom I had spent so many years together, a brave soldier and loyal friend, was killed by some cowardly and mean-spirited. The accompanying Americans shook their heads at this lust for murder and drove the cowardly scum away. The column moved on again. So this is what the captivity was like after 24 hours of captivity, the brutal murder of a wounded, bleeding soldier. Oh, what naive lads we were only half an hour ago before we witnessed what had happened. Our trip ended in the courtyard of the police station. The station was in the centre of Namur, and I remember the entrance gate well. Near the entrance stood an old Gothic church. It was dark when we drove through the gate. There were partisans guarding the entrance. That was a bad sign. As soon as the trucks left, the young guards shouted at and ordered us to line up. A hail of blows with rifle butts fell on those who were the last to get off the trucks. I was standing on my right and saw an American say something to the guerrillas, pointing at me. The guerrillas nodded and told me to follow them. They took me to a field officer who bandaged me up. As this was happening, I could hear my comrades screaming in pain, since a group of partisans were beating up a group of soldiers. I asked, "What's going on? Why are they beating?" The sergeant told me that they were selecting those from the Waffen-SS and parachute troops and were going to kill them. Then shots rang out in the courtyard and about 20 German soldiers were killed that day on November 7, 1944 in Namur. They did not die at the hands of Belgian soldiers, but at the hands of disembodied milkmen who displayed their red scars as important jewelry. At about 10 p.m., I was led through the deserted streets by two partisans. Our footsteps rumbled in the silence of the night. These sounds echoed in my ears like the deafening beat of the drums of death. Again, I assumed that my end was near, but this time I was mistaken. One of my companions suddenly spoke. He offered me an American cigarette and asked me if I was in a lot of pain. "You know," he said, "it is simply amazing that you can still walk with a fractured skull. We've been ordered to take you to a doctor, and we'll be there in a few minutes." It seems that the Americans told the Belgians that I had a fractured skull. On the orders of an American officer, I was to be treated. The fractured skull was apparently indicated by the constant bleeding from my left ear. Well, I hoped it would end well. I knew, of course, that my skull wasn't fractured, but I didn't know why I was bleeding. I was later told that the American had torn one of my major blood vessels with the muzzle of his carbine. After a few hundred meters, I was led to a house that resembled a school. Partisans and young men were shouting SSS. My escorts answered, "No, he is a colonel of the 2nd Panzer Division." The Americans want us to take him to the hospital. The young men incredulously pushed me into an ambulance, and I was taken to the Catholic hospital. On the way, the seminarian and one of my escorts told me that SS men and parachutists were shot on the spot. I listened to this monstrous statement almost with indifference. How many young soldiers who had not yet killed anyone had died at the hands of murderers? After all, many of my soldiers were still fairly new to the division in the last few days. They were barely 18 years old when they fell victim to the excited mob. Again, I thought that doom lay ahead of me. It wouldn't be long before I would be identified. I thought feverishly about how to get rid of my military book. It could not be left in the ambulance. It would be found in a few hours at the latest. I was taken to the operating room and made to lie down on the couch. A very friendly, German-speaking nun assisted me. The seminarian and the nun were brother and sister. The partisans saw me for the first time by candlelight and looked at me with interest. They were suspicious. The camouflage jacket seemed familiar to them and gave me away as a Waffen-SS soldier. It was high time I got rid of my traitorous military book. But how? These guys were watching me like hawks. At the last minute, I asked my sister to let me go to the toilet. After some hesitation, she allowed it, and I waddled through a few doors. None of the partisans accompanied me. The account book disappeared with lightning speed. However, I realized too late that the toilet pipes were broken, and my identification would simply be delayed for a few hours. The doctor decided that I would be put to bed first and the X-rays would be arranged for tomorrow. I waddled into the room, barely able to stand on my feet, and with the help of the partisans was put to bed. The loss of blood had weakened me to the utmost. I was really at my last breath. My soiled jacket was taken away by the partisans, and I watched as they searched my pockets for documents. Would I continue to be lucky? It didn't last long, and I was asked where my documents were. It all depended on how convincing my answer would be. I slowly opened my eyes and answered in a firm voice, Americans. For a split second, I was afraid to take a breath. Then I saw that the guards were satisfied with my answer. They shook my hand and left. In the middle of the night, I was given a clean pillow because I was still losing a lot of blood. Exhausted, I fell into a deep sleep and dreamed of my native places in Germany. I stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. The doctors treated me excellently. The nurses slowly gave me cigarettes and sometimes added a light snack. I was feeling better every day, and it looked like they wouldn't keep me in the hospital much longer. I thought feverishly about escaping. I was on the 4th floor, and the only way to escape was through a window. I would have to find some sheets and make a rope. Before I could realize this, however, I was transferred to Albert's barracks. The barracks was near the train station and was used by parachute and airborne units. I didn't like the fact that I was the only prisoner and that I was kept alone in an empty room in the corner of the barracks. My new quarters were hardly suitable for escape. High walls and relentless guards stood in the way of my freedom. My solitary confinement ended after 48 hours. The partisans sent a comrade in distress to me. Lieutenant Mueller had been captured north of Namur while trying to reach the German border with a group of German infantrymen. They had been fighting their way through the forests and fields of northern France and Belgium for over 3 weeks, relying entirely on the help of local people. They travelled hundreds of kilometres only to be captured very close to the border. We have been working together to improve our situation. Until now, we had been kept in terrible conditions. The heating problem was quickly solved. We broke chairs, tables, and cupboards for firewood and burned them in the fireplace. However, it was not so easy to improve the rations. Every day we were given the same soup. An addition to our family came 2 days later. Lieutenant Wagner, a platoon leader in the infantry division, was the third to join us. Wagner, like A. Mueller, had marched east for weeks to be captured on the Meuse River. He had qualities we lacked. He somehow managed to withhold a few hundred francs that helped us improve our menu. To find support for our intentions, we intended to engage the guards in conversation. We were pleased that a Belgian, a former military cadet who had been in a prisoner of war camp in Germany until 1943 and who had been liberated through the intervention of the King, had become our best ally. He was a cadre Belgian soldier and behaved accordingly. Expressing his indignation, he confirmed that German soldiers had been killed. The Red partisans were responsible. Helping the friendly Belgian to deliver supplies to us was a Russian prisoner who had been captured in 1942 and had managed to escape from the Belgian mine in the spring of 1944. After a short time, our helpers were joined by 2 real peace activists who fought for their country out of pure idealism and who had spent a good deal of time in the Gestapo cells. We could only maintain our physical strength with the help of these men. Of course, even they could only get bread, potatoes, carrots, and fruit. They had little food themselves and depended on receiving rations. However, the decent, honest attitude of these Belgians toward us helped us more than once in difficult moments. By that time, heavy fighting had broken out near Acre, and we thanked those who cared for us from the bottom of our hearts for every scrap of information. The former Red Army soldier was not particularly happy when he learned of the critical military situation of the Germans, especially on the Eastern Front. He viewed the Soviet victory without enthusiasm. The ordinary Russian soldier seemed to understand more about the intentions of the Soviet leadership than the fathers of the Casablanca Agreement. In any case, he had a healthier instinct than Sir Samuel Hoare, who responded on February 25, 1943, to a cautionary letter from Franco, the Spanish head of state, that I cannot accept the theory that Russia will be a threat to Europe after the war. Similarly, I reject the idea that Russia, at the end of hostilities, might launch a political campaign against Western Europe. You counter by saying that communism poses an enormous threat to the continent, and that a Russian victory would allow communists to march triumphantly across Europe. We have completely opposite points of view. Finally, will any nation be able to rule Europe alone after the war? Russia will be busy rebuilding itself and will be more dependent on help from the United States and Great Britain. Russia is not in the lead in the struggle for victory. The war effort of all is completely equal in achieving Allied victory. After the war, large American and British armies will occupy the continent. They will be composed of first-class soldiers. They will not be depleted and exhausted like the Russian armies. I dare predict that the British will represent the most powerful military force on the continent. British influence on the continent will then be as strong as it was in the days after the fall of Napoleon, backed by our military might. Our influence throughout Europe will be palpable, and we will participate in the reconstruction of Europe. This is what Sir Samuel Hoare, one of Britain's leading politicians, was saying. I believe the course of history has confirmed the fears of our caring Russian friend. His fears have proved justified. Russia, not England, has become the dominant power in Europe. Every squadron of bombers that flew with its deadly cargo at low altitude over the high ground along the Meuse towards our fiery homeland encouraged us to hatch plans of escape, but there was no way to freedom. We were guarded too tightly. One day the Belgians, in addition to the clothes we already had, brought us sets of German uniforms from old German stocks. I got a uniform and an overcoat. Now we were more or less protected from the cold, but we looked more like a band of robbers than German soldiers. Early in October, 2 Americans with a commander, a major of military police, showed up and we were put into a truck and put under heavy guard. Again, we had no opportunity to make our escape. We arrived that evening in Reims, at the police station used by the military police. The cells were full of riotous Negroes. They were intoxicated with victory, whereupon they were captured and locked up. The next morning we drove through the battlefields near Reims farther and farther west. By this time we had been absorbed in our escape plans and had noted the main salient features of the terrain. Now, however, we sat huddled in a corner of the car and gazed in amazement at the huge Allied supply depots. There was an incredible amount of ammunition, fuel, and uniforms. Supply depots one after another, kilometre after kilometre. In between were airfields and additional depots with spare artillery and tanks. Traffic on the roads and in the camps functioned as in peacetime. There was not a hint of camouflage or any precautions visible. We looked at it as a beggar looks at a rich man's house. Did the Americans realize, as they stood on the German border, how great was their advantage in armament and combat equipment? Toward evening, we proceeded through Compiègne. It was a long way from Compiègne 1940 to Compiègne 1944. The road in 1944 led to a large prisoner of war camp. Where would it lead from there? The camp made a huge impression on us. Barbed wire stretched as far as the eye could trace. Before we could get inside, we had to pass through 2 outer gates guarded by bored American soldiers. We were immediately taken before the camp commandant, who interrogated us meticulously, each one individually. I was recorded as Colonel Meyer of the 2nd Armored Division. My record book was thought to have been lost to the Americans in Naval. The camp commandant turned out to be an old Berliner whose law office was on Kurfürstendamm and who had emigrated to America in the 1930s. After a wide-ranging conversation, I was appointed assistant commandant and was asked to look after the officer contingent of the camp. I, along with Wagner and a Hummler, was assigned a small room, and we were happy to have our own corner. Our first priority was to make a thorough examination the next morning. The camp was divided into 3 wards, and there were several thousand people in the camp. As assistant commandant, I could move from ward to ward in search of comrades without difficulty. During my first round of the privates' quarters, I met a field officer from the 1st Parachute Division. He initiated me into the secrets of the camp, which was crawling with spies and traitors. Caution was the motto here. It didn't take long before all parts of the camp were infiltrated by our men. For a future escape, we organized a systematic replenishment of food supplies, which were distributed among the various barracks. We even became the happy owners of a compass. Lieutenant Wagner managed to keep it despite all sorts of searches. It all came down to the means of escape. We even got some bandaging material. A doctor from the parachutists joined our group and wanted to try to escape with us. One day, several hundred prisoners captured in the battles near Aachen were brought to the camp. They gave us the latest news from Germany. Among these prisoners were soldiers from the Leibstandard Division who told me what had become of my 12th Panzer Division. I was shocked when I heard about the murder of my loyal comrade Waldmüller. Sturmbannführer Waldmüller fell victim to the Maquis partisans on September 9 at Bosbode, 10 kilometers northwest of Wilsheim. The partisans had stretched a wire across the road. Waldmüller and his driver were knocked off their motorcycle. Both were seriously wounded, and then they were drowned like rats in a water-filled ditch. The brave Obersturmführer Huck ran into a landfill that had been blown up by partisans from behind some bushes and suffered serious burns. Judging by other reports from soldiers, the 12th SS Panzer Division was on rest and replenishment in the Plettenberg area of Sauerland. By this time, preparations for our escape were well underway. We knew that in order for our plan to succeed, we had to work hard, thinking out every detail of it. Time was precious. We expected that in a few days we would be transferred somewhere to make room for new batches of captured German soldiers. On November 7, about 5 p.m., I had a highly interesting but not very pleasant conversation with the camp commandant. I met him in the corridor of our barracks and was astonished when he pulled me into a corner in a very neighbourly manner and began the following conversing. "Mr. Colonel, you can do me a great favour by fulfilling one request of mine. I find myself in a very unpleasant situation. Extremely surprised. I promised him my help, but I had no idea what had happened. I have just received a report that a high-ranking SS officer is in the camp," said the commandant. "I would be highly displeased if such a person were actually in my camp." That was it. That's it. Thank goodness the lighting was so low that the fresh-faced American could not see the colour of my face. The surprise was complete. My tongue became like lead. I had to remain calm, complete, taking a deep breath. I promised the commandant my cooperation and asked the name of this SS officer and what he looked like. "Well, I don't," it was something like this. "Well, I don't know what his last name is. I don't know what he looks like either. I only know that he salutes dashingly and everyone smiles when he walks through the camp." Having assured him that I would take care of the case, I quietly said goodbye and disappeared into my room. How surprised Wagner and Müller were when I told them that I had promised to search for myself and hand myself over to the camp commandant. We quickly agreed to make an escape attempt the very next day. Lieutenants Müller, Wagner, and Fieldfelder Müller would also take part. On November 8, we as loggers assembled at the camp gate. We were going to start the long journey back to Germany from the forest of Campine. We were out of luck. Very few loggers were needed. Disappointed, we wandered back to the barracks. At about 11:00, I was called to the camp commandant's office. I said a few parting words to my buddies and followed the military policeman. The commandant was sitting at his desk, playing with his police baton. His face expressed determination. The expression on his face told me everything. However, I immediately noticed that he was not absolutely certain. I must remain calm. Some military policemen, tall as trees in the forest, stood at my side. In their hands they held batons carelessly. This was getting serious. The newly minted American shouted at me, "Take off your jacket. Take off your shirt." I stood there, naked to the waist. "Put your hands up." My God! The camp commandant's face changed. He gasped and gripped his desk tightly. He angrily uttered a couple of swear words in English before he asked me about the origin of the blood-type picture on my body. It was only then that I realized why I had to get naked. I hadn't thought at all about that traitorous tattoo. I really needed to buy time to find a plausible answer. I only responded to the repeated demand. I responded with a question. I politely asked the camp commandant to explain himself. This almost made the little guy go crazy. He continued to yell at me, claiming that I was an SS pig and that I was that wanted SS officer of high rank. It was time for me to act, or admit to the camp commandant and sense. You are mistaken. Although the Waffen-SS introduced blood-type markings, the Army tank forces also began using them for their tank crews. After such markings proved useful in the motorized divisions of the Waffen-SS, you will have to reconcile yourself to the fact that all tank school trainees were sent back to their units with these tattoos. This explanation had a bombshell effect on the military police. I was allowed to put my clothes back on and leave the room. The camp commander remained seated in his chair, exhausted by this confrontation. Half an hour later, the whole camp was turned upside down. The military police were looking for radio devices. The prisoners, you see, were planning an escape for November 9 and asked for weapons to be airdropped to them that night. We just laughed at the Americans' fantasies. Suddenly, we were told to pack up for shipment. Transportation for our evacuation had already arrived. For an hour we had to stomp through town and then climb into a waiting freight train. Wagner and a Humela were in the same wagon with me. Wagner immediately sat down on the floor and started making a hole in it. He started swearing at the top of his lungs. The wagon was made of hard wood, and it was almost unyielding. There was no way we were going to be able to pull the floor apart. But the two of them kept trying. They wanted to escape. I heard my name being shouted just before they left. They told me to get off the train and get into a waiting jeep. Well, they just got me. We quickly made our way back to camp. I was quite surprised to recognize one lieutenant standing in front of the administration building dressed as if for a camping trip. He, along with several Americans, was preparing to take a short walk in the vicinity of the camp. The lieutenant turned away shamefully, but in vain. My shout of "You miserable bastard" nevertheless reached his ears. This was the first cowardly creature in German uniform I had ever encountered. He was indeed formerly a junior lieutenant from an infantry division and had become a camp spy. The camp commandant made me stand facing the wall so that my fingertips were touching it, and my feet were 1.2 meters away from it. At every movement I received a light tap on the back with the butt of my rifle and a humiliating order to obey discipline. But all things come to an end, and soon I was placed in a special room. There I was guarded by 2 Americans with guns at the ready. The next morning I was taken by road through Compiègne to Paris, and from there to the airport west of Paris. By 2 p.m., I was already sitting in the airplane, looking down at the former battlefields of 1940 whizzing by. We had left the continent at Dunkirk, and only then did I rely on fate and put aside all thoughts of escape. The war was over for me. Europe lay behind me in ruins, bleeding from countless wounds. We flew over the English Channel, and the misty Albion appeared before